Welcome to the Celebrity Estates Wills of the Rich and Famous podcast. In this podcast, we break down high-profile celebrity estate planning cases for advisors and their clients. Most celebrity estate catastrophes are based on the same issues that everyday people face, just with the volume turned up. Our goal is to identify and extract the individual estate planning issues that lie at the heart of each story. We then discuss what advisors should expect and how to avoid common pitfalls. Hosted by wealthmanagement.com senior editor David Lenok.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of wealthmanagement.com's Celebrity Estates Wills of the Rich and Famous. For anyone new to the podcast, in each installment, myself and a guest take on a different celebrity estate and attempt to extract some key lessons that planners can apply to their more traditional clients. The idea being that celebrity estate planning stories, although often ridiculous in their details, generally have at their cores very basic issues that can just as easily apply to non-famous or fabulously wealthy clients. Our guest this week is Jeff Fishman. Jeff is the founder and managing member of JSF Financial in Los Angeles. Thanks for joining us, Jeff.
David, it's great to be here.
So normally this is the part where I introduce the celebrity subject of this week's episode and then run my mouth for about 5 minutes telling a story about their estate. We're going to throw a curveball this week, though. No celeb. Instead, we're going to flip our mission statement a bit and talk with Jeff specifically about advising higher profile clients and those in the entertainment industry, which is a topic a number of our listeners have expressed an interest in hearing us tackle. So Jeff, before we get into the real nitty gritty, do you mind telling us, our audience, a bit about yourself and your practice?
Sure, David. It's so I'm born and bred in Los Angeles and went to college and law school in New York. So I've basically spent my life here on both coasts. And after having practiced law for a couple of years, I'd gone through the UCLA financial planning program and decided to start my own fee-based financial planning practice, which I began 25 years ago. And being in the middle of Los Angeles, having grown up here, inevitably I have a lot of friends from childhood and other people that I've met who work throughout the entertainment industry. And our whole practice has been built upon referrals. And as you can imagine, those young producers or young writers suddenly become showrunners, become directors. They introduce you to others. And it's basically just been that word of mouth progression throughout the whole industry, which has taken us to where we are today.
Interesting. So, I know a lot of, for a lot of our listeners and a lot of advisors, working with sort of, entertainment clients and high profile clients like this is sort of an aspirational thing. So a very popular question we get is, how do I break into this industry? How do I start having these clients? It seems like you started collecting your client list during childhood.
It's funny. It is. It all goes down to relationships like anything else on the one hand. On the other hand, it's interesting. It's a type of an industry that you could get started if you want to start at the bottom. And we've all heard the stories of people working at the agencies in the mailrooms, coming from Harvard or Yale and literally going ahead and working in a mailroom at Creative Artists Agency or one of the others. And it's pretty much the same if you want to go ahead and start working in the industry. You've got to start going ahead and forging relationships with those kind of people, because the way the industry works is those people at the bottom inevitably want to then move up to somebody's desk and ultimately become, either an agent or become a young, from a writer's room to become a writer himself. A lead writer or a producer. And it's really just starting early with certain people in their career, like in any other industry, and hopefully growing with them.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point that I'm glad you brought up here, is that I think for a lot of people, the entertainment equals celebrity. So if someone's in the entertainment industry, they're automatically a high profile person, and it's just this leap, right? But in reality, there's an entire ecosystem that makes up the entertainment industry. And so and working with everyone among that ecosystem, much like working with clients, as you said, in other industries, is an important part of eventually working your way up to those higher up people.
Completely. And again, once you start forging relationships, and people forget the entertainment industry is, you've got in front of the camera, and you got all the people who work behind the camera. And there's a lot more people who work behind the camera than in front of the camera. And that whole industry behind the camera, they tend to be much what I'll call more consistent type of income situations. They tend to be far more stable. And so from a pure business standpoint, while the people in front of the camera are a lot more appealing and maybe sexy, the other side is actually a lot more attractive when you think about it from an overall business perspective.
You mentioned consistency of income. Can you kind of expound on that concept a little bit and sort of what that means with this sort of segment of clientele?
Sure. So if you are an executive at a studio, you're going to typically be under contract for multiple years. If you are a writer on a show, as long as the show's coming back and it's doing well, you're typically going to come back season after season. Alternatively, if you're talent on a show, and even if the show, or if you're on a movie, you're going from movie to movie. If you're on a show, not only are you subject to renewal, but more than that, if all of a sudden the show starts doing well, what typically will happen will be that the talent is then looking to earn more money per episode. And if the network or whoever's behind the show believes that those demands are getting out of hand, what happens to you, David? They kill you off. You're gone. And that's how that changes. So the difference between having a multi-year contract or having an ongoing deal is very different than someone who's going from project to project. And so as a result, you've got to be much more in tune with the feast or famine side of the industry when you're dealing on a talent side, as opposed to the other people who, like you said, in the other part of the ecosystem, who will be in a much more consistent, stable type of income situation.
So, I mean, if I can reiterate, I guess what you're saying, it sounds to me as if you're saying there's a large portion of the entertainment industry that is broadly similar to your traditional client who works in an office building in New York, or in a more traditional, as an accountant in a more traditional industry. And then there are the others that have, the people in front of the camera often who have, it's a very different situation.
Yeah, that is true. That is definitely true. Even though the April 15th deadline, I'm sure there's nobody out there who really strives to be in that kind of situation.
So, I mean, you mentioned this April 15th deadline and this idea of for people in front of the camera, that how inconsistent their income can be. So what are some of the tax issues that come up then with that sort of highly inconsistent income level?
So as you can imagine, there's going to be a lot of planning going from year to year based upon the peaks and troughs in somebody's income. So for someone who all of a sudden has a big income year because, let's say, they wrote this, they wrote this movie and ended up receiving a large payment in a single year, and the next year could be a development year, meaning they're working on new scripts, and as a result, their income is going to be far less, in the subsequent year until the next movie is made. And as a result, you're going to go ahead and try to, number one, come up with pension ideas that can maximize contributions in those peak earning years, number one. Number two is you're going to probably go ahead and do whatever you can to sort of bundle deductions in those peak years from a business standpoint. Because let's face it, the deductions in those years are going to be far more valuable than in those years when the income is at a trough.
Interesting. And then again, tied in with this idea of the inconsistent income is, there's that very first time you get the spike, right? So I know in every industry, we talk about sudden wealth syndrome, this idea that, someone could win the lottery or whatever. I think in most industries, you're sort of gradually working your way up. There's very little like, oh, I'm a waiter, and then all of a sudden I'm, the CEO of Morgan Stanley. Like these doesn't happen that way. But in entertainment, you can go from being a waiter with a bunch of scripts out to, oh my God, my script got bought. All of a sudden I have money.
100%. You could be 25 years old and you could be cast on a show, and all of a sudden you're receiving $50,000 per episode for being on a show at 25 years old. Same thing that you're scripting a bond. All of a sudden you receive a fee, which you never even imagined. And so part of the challenge is, like with anybody else, is when you're young in your 20s and all of a sudden if you receive a lot of money, you're not necessarily thinking and focused on long-term planning. It's another thing if you become the CEO of Morgan Stanley, like you mentioned, in your 40s or 50s, let's just say that you're going to have a much more mature perspective than maybe someone in their 20s who's going to be much more focused on, okay, well, how can I enjoy this now?
And I think also that brings up a question of, how do you get that client in the door? Right? It's obvious that they need advice, but to break through to a 25-year-old who all of a sudden went from waiting tables to having, money to burn, the first thing they think of is not, I need to talk to somebody about this.
Completely agree. And it's usually going to be responsible family members who take the position of, my son, my daughter, they need some assistance. They're in a position now that they're suddenly making a large amount of money, and they need to speak to someone professionally who can help them. And it often happens that way. It also happens, like I mentioned before, where you'll have a producer, someone who's been in the industry a longer time, or even a studio executive who forges a relationship with someone who's younger and who will say, you know what, you need to go ahead and start thinking of planning. And here's the people that I've used, and here's the people who we respect. And I think you should give them a call. Because as you can imagine, like you said, when you're waiting tables, the last thing you're thinking about is, how much can I go ahead and set aside in a pension for tax purposes this year?
Yeah, you're finally making money for the first time in your life. The last thing you want to do is think about like, oh, how can I give some other guy my money to help me make it work? It's like, I want to keep all this.
No, they're focused on rent and, can they get away from having 3 roommates or not?
So, along with this idea of sudden wealth syndrome and young people, getting money, I think you hear a lot of horror stories about, we talked about honest family members, but then there's also dishonest family members, and there are honest advisors and dishonest advisors, unfortunately. How much of an issue is, I guess, the creation of trust in entertainment industry as compared to sort of, more traditional industries?
Right. So creation of trust is huge for multiple reasons. Number one is you have people, like you said, who suddenly end up earning a lot of money. Oftentimes you have family, and it's the same thing in the athletic world as well, but where you have a lot of people who are maybe around that person, looking, hanging on, so to speak. And while there hopefully is 1 or 2 people in the family, and hopefully it's parents or an aunt or uncle who's trying to give the best objective advice to help that person out. There's oftentimes people who are surrounding that successful person and trying to think about, well, how about myself? And oftentimes you'll see people thinking about houses, or thinking about cars, or thinking about other things that they want and how they can capitalize on the situation to their benefit. And it's tough. It's really, really tough because, again, you suddenly have somebody who's not only come into a lot of money, but what often happens is those people who suddenly experience success, number one, it comes along with a lot of adulation. There's a lot of people around them. There's a lot of people suddenly at their beck and call who were never in their life before. So suddenly you start becoming, what I want to say, a little bit, like you think you're somewhat invincible. You think this is going to continue forever. You think you're now on a roll and this is just the beginning. And it's like, okay, what's it make a difference if I go ahead and give this person this or give this person that, or I invest in that restaurant, or I go ahead and I take this extravagant trip, it'll keep going. And that leads to part of the biggest challenge of being able to advise them that, what, despite all of the adulation and you're great and this movie is great or this show is great or whatever else, what, the music could stop. And if the music stops next year, then what? And what do you have left to show for it? And that's part of the difficult conversations we have to have with those kind of clients.
And then there's also, I think, the flip side of that that too big to fail kind of mentality is that with the advisors I've spoken to and the athletes that I've spoken to, is that there is a certain feeling of responsibility. When you're waiting tables and living with roommates and everyone is going through the same sort of struggle at the bottom, there is a camaraderie and a sense of community that can develop. And you can feel, when one of you finally makes it, there can be okay, well, I made it and I have all these friends who are struggling, but they're so great and all they need is a little help. And, and it's very easy to fall into that, that now you're, the daddy warbucks of your group.
Completely. That's the case. Friends and family. And there's a sense of responsibility, like you mentioned. And so it's all about how do you balance that? How do you balance that sense of responsibility combined with the fact that you're now successful, but who's to say that's going to continue? And so as you can imagine, from a pure psychological perspective, there's a lot of discussions and counseling that's going to surround this kind of a situation to help these kind of people be able to make good decisions and balance all those different demands and expectations in their lives.
So you had just mentioned in passing athletes. I know that there's a lot of, especially in the sort of the ecosystem that supports them, there's a lot of similarities. Are there any sort of key differences with sort of clients that are professional athletes in terms of what sort of advice they're facing versus someone in entertainment?
Completely. And the reason is because depending on the type of sport we're looking at, their window could be even shorter. And then there's always an issue of an injury that could happen tomorrow that could basically completely sideline, if not end your career. And that's part of the issue. I mean, if you think about Olympic athletes, and I've had clients who've been, gold medal winners, the challenge there is that you have a really, really narrow window to be able to capitalize on that kind of success. If you're playing football, the average career, I think, is less than 3 years. If you're in, what we know what the NFL stands for, David? Not for long, right?
I was going to go with no fun league, but yeah, not for long.
Exactly, not for long, no fun league. And so you think about those type of situations, and it's a really, really limited window. So on the entertainment side, I mean, you hope that you're going to have a longer window. And again, if you're a writer, if you're a producer, if you're on the agency side, I mean, you tend to expect that you're going to have a much longer career. If you're on the talent side or you're on the acting side, we've all read stories, especially about actresses who, when they hit 40, that their careers change dramatically. And so, but let's face it, if they're starting in their early to mid 20s, there's still a lot of earning years to be able to capitalize on who they are and their talents. So there is a very different type of projection that you go through depending on what someone's doing.
And I think it's important also to point out that the one thing in common here is, though, it seems that when you're dealing with these inconsistent incomes and these short windows, that, in your head, you're like, oh, how could I plan long-term? But in reality, long-term planning is far more important for people in those situations than it is for someone in more of a salaried position.
Completely, 100%. But not only that, I mean, this is where you then have to stress things like an emergency fund. You're going to go ahead and hoard a lot of cash. You're going to try to avoid any kind of significant debt, because if the music stops, it's going to be very hard to be able to service that debt.
Yeah, and I mean, liquidity is really sort of the operating word there, right?
Completely. Yep.
So, you mentioned again in passing this idea that, for women in front of the camera, there is, sadly, a very different career path and a shorter career path. And, women face struggles in every industry, unfortunately, still. But, if you had sort of a female client in the entertainment industry come in, would you advise her differently with this in mind than you would for a male in the same position?
So the advice is similar and we're talking in front of the camera now.
Yeah.
So, right. The advice is similar, which is, okay, you're going to be in this show or you're going to be in this movie, and who knows what happens next. So we're going to try to reinforce that with, people, whether they're male or female, actors or actresses. At the same time, I mean, as we've seen, I mean, there are male actors who literally just sort of go from role to role, and they tend to have much longer careers. So that's going to be a conversation that we are going to have with actresses, to go ahead and I think just sort of take a step back and say, okay, realistically, how long do you want to continue doing this? And then there's the other side, David, which is you often have actresses who say, wait a second, I want to have a family. I want to start a family. I want to have children. And as you can imagine, that's also the type of scenario which the men don't have to worry about. But for the woman, that could also be career altering.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, we say the men don't have to worry about it. They obviously are having families, but it's not affecting them physically and shutting them down necessarily in the way that it will, biologically for a woman.
Exactly.
So, we've sort of covered a very broad swath of this portion of the industry here. If you could sum it up, I guess, what do you think the most pressing concern that your clientele sees is?
So I think if we take a look at this past year, David, going through the pandemic, I think, everybody looks at things similarly and recognizes the fact that when you thought things were going to be predictable, or you thought that you could plan, it's amazing how all of a sudden that things can change to an extent that you never thought imaginable. And it ended up impacting people in the entertainment industry, I think, dramatically greater than in many other industries. Not to in any way diminish the fact that we had almost 10 million more people who are unemployed than were a year ago. But all of a sudden, you're on a show and production is halted. All of a sudden, you thought a movie that was going to go, and guess what? There's no movie. And by the way, these people, they don't continue receiving paychecks. You're a writer on a TV show. Again, there's no production. There's nobody able to go to a movie. Or taking it a step further, you have studios who go ahead and say, you know what, we're really going ahead and switching our whole approach and our whole strategic vision, and it's going to be much more in the area of streaming than what we've done traditionally. And as a result, you have massive layoffs where I believe some of the studios have already cut their workforce by 10 to 20%. It's that kind of scenario that has had a huge impact on people throughout the entertainment industry, so that if you haven't planned well for that kind of a drought, you're going to be in a really, really challenging situation.
Yeah, this is just a continuation of this idea of planning for the trough that you always have, except this trough has been sort of like unlike any other trough we've seen in the last sort of 70 years.
And this is when you were working, and all of a sudden work is halted, right? And by the way, it's still a situation that production can get shut down anytime. And you think about the fact people thought, well, I'm shooting in the UK. That's fine. Well, guess what? No, now there's no shooting in the UK, right? That's shut down because of the pandemic. And it's created a whole different type of concern. Like you said, that's nobody's ever contemplated before. While it's similar to the fact that you always prepare for troughs, this is one that I think, again, nobody could have imagined, only because you're in the midst of production, you're in the midst of a shoot, and all of a sudden you have something called force majeure clauses being invoked and basically being shut down, and your income stream that you pretty much not only counted on, but you thought you would receive under contract suddenly disappears.
So, we've covered a huge swath of content here. I'd like to thank Jeff Fishman for being a really fantastic guest, and I think just a very informative interview. Thanks for joining us, Jeff.
David, it's great being here. Thanks so much for having me.
And for our audience, I'll see you, or I guess you'll hear me, on the next episode of Celebrity Estates.
Thank you for listening to the Celebrity Estates Wills of the Rich and Famous podcast. Click the subscribe button below to become notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of InformaWealthManagement.com. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning.